everyone, and welcome back to another episode here on Swish City. I'm your host, Bruce Veliz, and in today's episode, we're doing another one of our NBA offseason breakdowns and season previews as we dive into every single team before the 2025-2026 NBA season. And in today's episode, we're going to be discussing the Charlotte Hornets, a team in the Eastern Conference that has made some moves here and is looking to be better than what they have been in the past, dealing with these injuries, with their second-year head coach, Charles Lee, looking to ingratiate some more chemistry and culture within the Charlotte Hornets. So without further ado, let's dive in and discuss this team. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section and hit that subscribe button if you're not already. But like I mentioned earlier, the Charlotte Hornets are looking to bring this new culture, bring this new identity with second-year head coach Charles Lee, who last year ultimately was doing a fantastic job with this young core and bolstering some of these young guys to be some developmental projects, but dealt with some injuries with some of their star players that really hindered that. But with hopefully no injury-riddled season this year and some better water over in Charlotte, they can see some better production. As like I mentioned earlier in the introduction, they made a numerous amount of moves to really change their course in this Eastern Conference, as we know, with Jason Tatum and Tyrese Halliburton being out for at least a majority of the season, if not the entire season, for their respective teams. The Celtics and Pacers are set to be a little bit worse in this Eastern Conference, leaving it seemingly wide open. And for the Hornets, they want to take massive advantage of this, so that's why they went out and made these big-time moves. So let's break down their additions and go over who the Hornets brought into their team this offseason. So like I stated, the Hornets made many additions, and we're first going to dive into the trades, in which they brought in 2 new faces, but made 3 trades, as they ultimately flipped one of the pieces that they received in a trade to send out. So first, they brought in Colin Sexton from the Utah Jazz. Sexton was a guard prioritized at the trade deadline by many teams, but ultimately was not moved, with presumably Utah wanting a little bit more in return for these players. But with Austin Ainge, their new GM, kind of coming in, he said, we're going to be bad and we're going to trade these players basically for nothing. And that's what they did, unfortunately, with some guys like John Collins and ultimately Colin Sexton to the Hornets, as they gave him up for Jusuf Nurkic, which Jusuf Nurkic is just a salary filler contract. He's going to be viable for the Utah Jazz ultimately as a backup center or even as a starting center, depending on what they do with their Walker Kessler, Kyle Filipowski situation over there in Utah. But they could have prioritized at the trade deadline or even the previous trade deadline to move off of Colin Sexton and get so much more value for him. And ultimately, they did not want to do that. I don't know why. But Sexton, I think, is going to be a solid addition for the Hornets. Notoriously, the Hornets are known to lose a lot of their guards and to be very weak at the guard position when their superstar guard that they've invested in so much in, LaMelo Ball, gets injured and is presumably out for the entire season. So adding some depth here, specifically with Colin Sexton, who could not only play the point guard but play the 2 and could play off ball alongside a player in LaMelo Ball, I think is going to be very, very viable. I think he's going to be one of the perfect 6-man type of guys alongside Trey Mann here for this unit, and I think is going to be seemingly maybe not a long-term fit for Charlotte. Maybe he ultimately is with him in this new role, but I think he is going to have a fantastic season where he's going to ultimately showcase himself to become a dominant 6-man for the next couple of years. Then next we got Pat Connaughton. He was brought in from the Milwaukee Bucks, who needed to shed some salary and in their free agency to make some more moves. They had looked to try to trade Pat Connaughton to duck out in the second apron last trade deadline, failed to do so, but they ultimately do it now, trading him to Charlotte, where he's basically going to be a depth wing here for this Charlotte Hornets team. They gave up Veseli Micic, who they got in the deal with Mark Williams, which we'll get into that third trade, like I mentioned, which they sent Mark Williams to the to the Phoenix Suns in return for Veseli Micic. They essentially traded for Veseli Micic back, who was on a team option, was going to get waived, was going back to Europe, basically stated since last year. But with all that being said, he gets flipped after being acquired from Mark Williams. It was Veseli Micic and Liam McNeely for Mark Williams and another future first. Mark Williams goes to the Suns, and then they trade Vasa Micic to the Bucks, who presumably cut him and let him go. But they ultimately technically by doing this lose a roster spot, but by doing so gain one with a younger rookie. They also made some big signings here this offseason, going and getting Spencer Dinwiddie from the Dallas Mavericks, once again eating into that point guard depth. Mason Plumlee adding into their front court depth from the Phoenix Suns, basically stealing him away from the team that they just traded for to Mark Williams to, which is kind of funny because they had a lot of trades that they had this offseason. And then ultimately bringing in two-way guys in Antonio Reeves and Drew Peterson, who have really looked solid for their respective teams in their minimum roles. Obviously, with the Celtics, Drew Peterson didn't really get much burn, but when he was out there and even for the main Celtics, he was a very effective three-point scorer. And Antonio Reeves, coming out of Kentucky, he was a solid player for the New Orleans Pelicans during their injury-riddled season, and I think he's going to be someone that they could kind of invest in within this two-way system alongside KJ Simpson, who was on this roster last year and also looked really solid during the Summer League as a shot creator and scorer. The Hornets have a lot of young talent that they're basically just prying from other teams and just trying to invest in, and then hopefully having it all pan out onto standard contracts, similar to what I think the Memphis Grizzlies have done these last couple seasons with their two-ways. I think the Charlotte Hornets are really investing into that this year, and I think that's a pretty solid deal. And then lastly, the players that they drafted. Once again, the Hornets making 4 selections, so really bringing in this youth movement, like I've stated, for Charles Lee to ingratiate this culture, to become this really dominant head coach, and I guess essentially make the Charlotte Hornets a destination for young talent to thrive in, but also a state where free agents want to go to, and that's where they're going to invest into these young players. With Con Kneppel, obviously went to Duke University, one of the better shot creators and scorers in this draft class, playing alongside Cooper Flagg, stays in that home state. Then you have Liam McNeely coming from UConn, another wing scorer that was fell in the draft here over these last couple weeks during the combine, but presumably was a lottery pick before then. And then you have Sion James, Con Kneppel's Duke teammate, and then Ryan Kalkbrenner from Creighton University, the big man down there. So 2 Duke players and then 2 players from the Big East, all presumably players that played on the East Coast. I mean, Ryan Kalkbrenner playing over in Nebraska and Creighton, but you know what I mean. All Big East teams kind of on the East Coast, all familiar with each other. This is going to be great team building for them, and then I think resulting in the Charlotte Hornets having a good developmental core. I also really trust Charles Lee as a head coach. He was a solid assistant for the Boston Celtics, and I think his ability to really mesh and build character with these young players is going to be key, and he learned a lot of that from Joe Mazzulla, and I think he's going to translate that into Charlotte, which I think them kind of changing out their core and really investing into this newer, younger talent is very smart for them, because I feel like in the past, some of these players have really worked past their point in Charlotte that they've had to move off of. And speaking of players they've moved off of, let's get into who the Charlotte Hornets lost. Now, they ultimately went up and lost a bunch of players here in free agency. They went and lost Mark Williams, who they traded to the Phoenix Suns once again for Vasilije Micic. They had no room for Mark Williams anymore. They didn't want to have Mark Williams anymore. They tried to trade him at the trade deadline last year, but with the Lakers and the injuries, it failed. So they were seemingly going to move off of him. It seemed like now they didn't really replace him. They did draft a second-round pick in Kalkbrenner. They do have Moussa Diabate and Mason Plumlee, who they did sign to kind of fill in that role. We'll have to wait and see who really steps up for them in that center position. They also traded away Jusuf Nurkic, who was a mid-season addition for the Hornets, basically just a salary filler for them, and then was a tradable asset for them because he was on an expiring contract. And that was kind of the conundrum with the Suns, was even though they had the issues with him last year, do you trade him? Do you not trade him? They ultimately wound up doing so, and then the Hornets get the benefactor of it because they get to flip Jusuf Nurkic for Colin Sexton, a guard that's going to be very suitable for them. And then Vasilije Micic, once again, he wasn't going to play for the Hornets. He was slated to go overseas. So being able to get off of his contract for Pat Connaughton, someone that could be viable for you, I think is a smart idea for the Charlotte Hornets, because the Bucks did not want to keep Connaughton. And then players that left in free agency were Josh Okogie, who was traded for Nick Richards from the Phoenix Suns to the Charlotte Hornets. He was a player very similar to a player in Cody Martin, who they traded away to the Suns, and that Jusuf Nurkic deal could be a viable asset as a defensive wing for them. Now, he ultimately kind of falls into a weird spot with guys like Josh Green and Grant Williams, who are a little bit on higher contracts, and with him being on a cheaper, more expendable one, it was easier for the Hornets to kind of waive him because they had no attachment. They didn't sign him to that deal. He ends up going to sign with the Houston Rockets to just be some more wing depth for them, and I think that's going to be great for him. For the Phoenix Suns, he was solid in that role, and for the Hornets, I think he was too. So I think for the Rockets, he's going to be even better. They also lost Seth Curry, who signed it he was waived by the Hornets. He signs an Exhibit 9 training camp deal to go over and try to compete with the Warriors to go play with his brother and make it to the actual Splash Bros. They also waived Nick Smith Jr. as the Hornets presumably had 18 players signed to roster spots, so they had to make some cuts, and they still have 16 guys. So, like I mentioned, one more player will not be on this final roster going into this season, but Nick Smith was one of those players that unfortunately did not really stick. He was part of the players that was drafted a couple years ago, really solid high school player and college athlete, but never really caught the groove in the NBA offensively. It still has the talent to be an offensive level threat from 3-point range, and for the Los Angeles Lakers, I believe in their second preseason game actually was a very valuable asset for them. So I think that could be a piece for them to bring in on a two-way deal, and maybe he could get us back to an NBA contract on a new team and a new face in a new place is something that I always appreciate. And then lastly, two other players that were on this Hornets team, I believe, on two-way contracts were Damian Ball and Wendell Moore Jr. They both were waived by the Hornets or let go. They have now signed Exhibit 10 deals, competing for two-way spots and or to make either the G League respectives of the Boston Celtics and the Phoenix Suns. Now, they also have two players that have gone unsigned, and those are Taj Gibson and Daquan Jeffries. Jeffries was someone who was brought in from the New York Knicks side of things when the Charlotte Hornets had to get involved for the Karl Anthony Towns, Julius Randle's trade at the late last of offseason. He was supposed to essentially get waived, but looked promising in their preseason games. He stuck around in Charlotte and was someone, from my understanding, was a solid role player for them. But ultimately, with them investing so much into more younger talent and making moves on the trade market, they don't have the roster spots for Daquan Jeffries. And with that being said, he does kind of fall short. Taj Gibson, obviously a little bit older as well. We'll have to wait and see what Taj Gibson, if he's brought back or called back by the Charlotte Hornets, New York Knicks, Chicago Bulls, whatever. But ultimately, I do think it is time for Taj Gibson to be done. So that leaves the Charlotte Hornets, lastly, with 16 players on this roster. So let's go over their prediction of where I think they're going to finish and going over who I think might potentially get cut and going over the depth chart. So first, we're going to go over the depth chart here. And when looking at this depth chart, it actually doesn't look too terrible in some aspects. I really do like the guard room here. LaMelo and Con Kneppel, I think, are going to be able to be a solid offensively. You got Brandon Miller, who can slash and still cut. Miles Bridges, and then Musa Diabate. Kind of finishing out that front court is a little bit weak in my opinion. I ultimately think the Charlotte Hornets need to move off of Miles Bridges at this point, regardless of the things that have happened in the past. I just think this fit here is just not going to work. I don't think they need to really invest into him as much. I think they need to kind of go into a different direction into the power forward, and maybe that's trying to trade for a younger one or something like that. I don't have a particular name in mind, but I just think that the time with Miles Bridges and the Charlotte Hornets just is a little bit over, and similar to some of these other guys that they've moved off of, right? Guys like Mark Williams, Nick Smith Jr., guys that have been drafted in the past that have kind of moved on seemingly. I think that's kind of where we have to stand with Miles Bridges, similar to a guy in PJ Washington where we realize it doesn't really fit. Ultimately, that can make them invest into a center. I don't necessarily know, but that's just kind of my opinion. I'm excited to see how Con Kneppel and Brandon Miller work with LaMelo Ball. Ultimately, with Con being able to be a catch-and-shoot scorer off the ball, with LaMelo being the dominant ball handler. But then also, I'd like to see how it looks in reverse, with Con Kneppel having some ball dominance and LaMelo Ball working off ball. I think that's going to look a little bit worse, but we'll ultimately have to see. Maybe that we'll see more Con on ball when Trey Mann or Colin Sexton is out there on the court alongside of them, because they can be a little bit better of an off-ball fit. But that's something that I think is going to be very interesting. One thing that is very key is this guard room here, because I think they have a lot of great players. Obviously, Trey Mann, Colin Sexton. When they traded for Colin Sexton, I ultimately thought Trey Mann was gone. I didn't think he was going to come back to the Charlotte Hornets. I thought that's that filler for that backup point guard. Trey Mann's a solid player. He had a great backup year last year, but he's going to find a role somewhere else. But he's still brought back here. So ultimately, with the Charlotte Hornets, I do think one of Spencer Dinwiddie or Pat Connaughton will be let go. I just think that there's just going to be too much veteran guard room people in there, and I think that Spencer Dinwiddie can basically kind of do what Colin Sexton and Trey Mann realistically do, just at a little bit of a worse level. And I think that even though he has that better leadership, he's a little bit more of a playmaker comparative to a combo guard compared to Trey Mann and Colin Sexton. I do think that they need that offensive firepower, and I think that that's where it's going to come in. I think Dinwiddie is on a cheaper contract than Connaughton is, so it would be easier to waive him. But who knows? Maybe there is a trade that comes down the line where something else happens within this roster, like it is a Miles Bridges, and both of them stay. I could be just guessing. But let's look at the wing room here. We got Liam McNeely, Josh Green, and Sion James. Sion James, obviously, being a second-round pick, probably going to get some burn with this Charlotte Hornets team. Will probably be just a guy at the end of the bench. I'm really curious to see what happens with Liam McNeely, because he was obviously selected late in the first round from the pick that was acquired from the Mark Williams deal, and I think he's going to be very solid on the wing alongside LaMelo Ball, and I think having all these scoring and shooting alongside LaMelo Ball clearly proves that the Hornets are going to be a top-tier offensive team. The one glaring issue is going to be the defense, and that's where Josh Green comes into play. He obviously has had some success with the Dallas Mavericks before being traded to the Charlotte Hornets. That's the contract that he is now currently sitting on, but hasn't been able to really stand out for the Hornets, and maybe it's because they have been investing in other guys, or maybe he just hasn't been playing up to par like he was in Dallas and isn't not just a great quality role player anymore. I'd like to see what really happens with him. Same thing with Grant Williams coming off that ACL injury. I'd like to see what investment he gets in after signing that deal with Dallas, getting signed and traded from Boston to Dallas, and then being traded from Dallas to Charlotte because he was not good in Dallas and Dallas did not like him. I'd like to see what his role could be for the Hornets this year, playing as that stretch forward as a defensive player, because they also invested in Tejan Saloon, who they selected last year. First half of the season did not look that great. Second and a half of the year definitely looked a lot better offensively, and I like to see maybe even him get the starting spot to see what he can invest in to be, because what you took the number 9th overall pick with him, you got to see what he can be. At least you took him over Matas Buzelis and stuff like that, and clearly Buzelis has looked pretty dominant, so I'd love to see what Saloon could look like. And then the center room, like I mentioned, Musa Diabate, Mason Plumlee, Ryan Kalkbrenner. Kalkbrenner, coming from Creighton, a fantastic rim protector and shot blocker, I think is going to be someone that the Charlotte Hornets got incredible value on in the second round, and I think is going to be a key backup for them for the future. Plumlee, I've seen in Charlotte, he's a solid passer and connector as a big man, but that's basically it. I don't necessarily know how much value he's going to bring. He's only ahead of Kalkbrenner at the moment because he is a veteran, but I do think by the end of the season, Plumlee will officially be that tertiary center behind Kalkbrenner. And then you have Musa Diabate, who was the starting big for a majority of the second half of the season for the Charlotte Hornets, as Mark Williams was dealing with injuries and Nick Richards was officially traded. Diabate looked pretty promising as that shot blocker once again. We'll have to see what he can become this season, and I'm excited to see him be a lob threat alongside LaMelo Ball. But ultimately, the Charlotte Hornets, where do they fall in the Eastern Conference? We're talking about all of this. Unfortunately, they fall 9th. I think they are just a little worse compared to some of the top teams in the East here, but I do think that they have the potential to be even better than 9th. I think that the highest, in my personal opinion, they could be is probably 6th, maybe 7th, but I think 9th is a very comfortable spot. I think the Sixers will deal with more injury problems, and I think that the Hornets this season, even though they have dealt with injuries in the past, look like they have a more concrete roster. You look at this depth chart, I know that there are a lot of young players and rookies, but LaMelo Ball, Con Kneppel, Brandon Miller, Miles Bridges, Musa Diabate, Trey Mann, Colin Sexton, Liam McNeely, Josh Green, Grant Williams, Tejan Saloon, Spencer Dinwiddie. There's at least 11 to 12 players that were NBA viable last season on this roster, and I think that's going to go a long way for the Charlotte Hornets, specifically with Charles Lee at the helm there leading the wave. I ultimately do think they are a little bit better than the Heat, just because the Heat don't really look the Heat might have better star player power, but with better names and Tyler Hero and Bam Adebayo, but they just don't mesh. The Raptors, I just don't think are going to be that solid. And then the Wizards, Bulls, and Nets, I just don't think have enough pieces to really contend. Could be wrong, right? Like I said, the Charlotte Hornets, a lot of people do go high on them at some points in the past couple of years, and then they completely flame out. So that could be the reasoning here with Charlotte. It could be another injury-riddled season, but I don't think so. I think this is the year where the Hornets turn the tide. We saw it towards the second half of last year where they actually started to click and get a little bit better with Charles Lee, and I think this is going to be the season where, yes, maybe they make the play-in, maybe they don't even make the playoffs, but at least they give the fans some excitement, some hope, and they can continue to build off this success into the future seasons to be a top-tier Eastern Conference opponent. So let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section on the Charlotte Hornets. Do you think I'm too high? Do you think I'm too low on the Hornets? I'd love to know your thoughts. Like I said, thank you guys so much for tuning into these videos and hitting that subscribe button. And I catch you guys in the next one. Have a great rest of your day, and peace out, everyone.